Friends, right now you see on screen my coin depicting Mars, the god of war. This is a double denarius of Roman Emperor Gordian, and where there is war, there are always victors and the vanquished. Today I will tell you about the nightmare that awaited those defeated legionnaires of the Roman army who were unlucky enough not to die on the battlefield with weapons in their hands, for the divine emperor of course, and they fell into captivity. I will also tell you how the very system of power motivated its warriors to fear captivity more than death on the battlefield. Imagine a centurion from one of the legions destroyed, for example, in the Teutoburg forest. Just yesterday, he commanded 100 elite warriors, wore silver fallery on his chest, dreamed of an estate in Campania after retirement. And today Germanic priests lead him, bound and bloodied, to a sacred grove where a fate worse than death awaits him, to become a living sacrifice to the Germanic god of war. And believe me, this death promised to be anything but simple. I will tell you in detail what happened to him, as well as to thousands of others. In the realities of that time, falling into captivity was a disgrace far worse than death. In Roman understanding, a captive ceased to exist as a person. He became a thing, an object of buying and selling. However, we all know that for a cucumber to become pickled, it must first be immersed in brine. For a legionnaire to fear surrender on the battlefield, he had to be raised fearing captivity. How did military commanders and authorities achieve this? For instance, Suetonius describes Augustus's policy: all who rebelled too often or treacherously, referring, naturally, to legionnaires, he punished only by selling them as prisoner slaves on condition that they serve their bondage far from their homeland and receive freedom no earlier than after 30 years. 30 years, think about this number. A young legionnaire of 20 became free at 50, if he survived. An old, broken, sick, toothless man forgotten by all in a foreign land. The greatest shame: why Romans feared captivity more than death. To understand the true scale of captivity's tragedy for a Roman, one must delve into the very essence of the Roman mentality. Virtues, courage, honor, dignitas, dignity. These concepts were not mere words, they were the foundation of Roman identity. The god of courage and military valor, virtus, was minted by emperors on silver denarii with which they paid their legions. In Roman law existed the concept of capitis deminutio maxima, complete loss of legal capacity. A captive lost everything: citizenship, property, family. Legally, he died. His wife could remarry without condemnation from others, children could be adopted by another, property could pass to heirs. Suetonius provides a chilling example from the times of civil wars. After the capture of Perusia, Augustus executed many captives, all who tried to beg for mercy or justify themselves. He cut short with 3 words: "You must die." And this is the future father of the fatherland, the merciful Augustus, far from the cruelest and most insane ruler of the empire in his actions. So what can be said about the fate of captives in the hands of barbarians? But even returning from captivity, a Roman did not regain his former status. There existed the concept of post liminium, the right of return, but it was limited by many conditions. Many preferred death to such disgrace. Seneca in his Moral Letters provides a stunning example. Telesphorus, a favorite of King Lysimachus. The enraged Lysimachus, cutting off his nose and ears, kept him in a pit until he lost human appearance. And this was not a barbarian, but a Hellenistic king, heir to Alexander the Great. Here's what Suetonius tells us about Roman military discipline. In cohorts that retreated before the enemy, Augustus executed every 10th man and transferred the rest to barley bread. Barley bread instead of wheat, this was humiliation. Suetonius explains, barley on campaign was given to pack animals, soldiers usually received wheat bread. What's even more humiliating? Imagine, yesterday's conquerors of the world eating donkey feed, but even this was better than captivity. Even more cruel was the punishment for those who tried to avoid military service. A Roman knight who cut off the thumbs of his 2 young sons to save them from military service, he ordered sold at auction with all his property. If they treated their own this way, what awaited captives? Carrhae, the beginning of nightmare. Carrhae, this name became synonymous with catastrophe for Romans long before Teutoburg. In 53 BCE, the army of Marcus Licinius Crassus, 7 legions, 40,000 men, was destroyed by the Parthians. Suetonius briefly mentions this tragedy. Standards were captured from Crassus at Carrhae and from Antony in 35 BCE. Behind this sparse line lay the fates of tens of thousands of Romans. What happened to the captured legionnaires of Crassus? Ancient sources differ in details but agree on the main point. They were deported to the eastern borders of the Parthian Empire, to Margiana, the territory of modern Turkmenistan. Imagine, Roman citizens, accustomed to the Mediterranean climate, found themselves in Central Asian steppes, thousands of miles from home. But most surprising is the mysterious story of the city of Lycian in Chinese Gansu province. Chinese chronicles of the Han Dynasty describe strange warriors who in 36 BCE fought against the Chinese as part of Qiongnu forces. These warriors used unusual tactics. They formed fish scales. Modern historians recognize in this description the Roman testudo, turtle, the classic battle formation of legionnaires with interlocked shields. Local legends speak of people with green eyes who settled in these places. Genetic research has shown an unusually high percentage of European markers among residents of Lycian village. Could these be descendants of captives from Crassus's army? Imagine the journey. From Rome to Mesopotamia, from Mesopotamia to Margiana, from Margiana to the Qiongnu, from the Qiongnu to China, 10,000 miles from home. Pliny the Elder in his Natural History mentions that the Parthians used Roman captives as instructors. They taught Parthian youth Roman military techniques. Irony of fate, Roman military science turned against Rome itself. Another reason why the Eternal City tried its utmost to make surrender in captivity worse than death. Suetonius reports an important detail about the return of standards, and the Parthians at his Augustus's demand yielded Armenia to him without question and returned the standards. This happened in 20 BCE, 33 years after Carrhae. The standards were returned, and incidentally, Augustus was immensely proud of this, even minting a silver denarius for the occasion. But about the people, Suetonius is silent. Other sources are silent too. 10,000 Roman citizens simply vanished in the sands of the east. Teutoburg, Germanic hell, 3 legions disappear forever. But the real nightmare erupted in September 9 CE. Suetonius describes Augustus's reaction with chilling details. Upon news of this, Augustus ordered guards stationed throughout the city to prevent disturbances. He extended the terms of provincial governors so that allies would be kept in subjection by experienced and familiar men. And they say he was so crushed that for several months in a row he did not cut his hair or beard and repeatedly struck his head against doorposts, crying out, "Quintilius Verus, give me back my legions," and each year marked the day of defeat with mourning and grief. 3 legions ceased to exist. As cruel punishment and an example to the living, their numbers were never again used in the Roman army. 20,000 men, a whole city, disappeared in the Germanic forests. But what happened to the captives? Here Tacitus comes to our aid. In the commentary to Suetonius, his Germania is quoted. The Germans fear captivity much more for their women than for themselves, so communities, forced to provide noble girls among hostages, more strictly fulfill their obligations. If Germans so valued their women in captivity, what did they do with captured Roman men? Archaeological finds at Carrhae, the presumed site of the battle, paint a horrific picture. Skulls nailed to trees, bones bearing traces of ritual cuts, altars in sacred groves with traces of human sacrifice. Germans didn't simply kill captives, they sacrificed them to their gods. Particularly valuable sacrifices were considered centurions and tribunes, Roman officers. They were tortured with special ingenuity, believing that the suffering of a noble victim would appease the gods. Simple legionnaires faced a different fate. Those not sacrificed immediately became slaves. A Roman citizen, yesterday marching under the golden eagles of the legion, now herded the cattle of a Germanic chief, worked his land, lived in a dugout with pigs. Seneca in a letter to Lucilius tells a story that shows sometimes death was more merciful than captivity. When Varius was defeated, many noble Romans, prepared by senatorial or equestrian rank to hold high offices, were humiliated by fate and turned into herdsmen or guards. Imagine a man of senatorial dignity, prepared to govern provinces, now guards Germanic cattle. A man whose ancestors sat in the curia sleeps on straw next to animals. Slavery as punishment, Rome's official policy. But most shocking is not the cruelty of enemies, but Rome's own policy. Suetonius clearly formulates Augustus's principle, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the story, about how rebels for disobedience were sold into slavery for a full 30 years far from their homeland. Think about it, essentially the Roman emperor himself sold Roman citizens into slavery, and not just into slavery without hope of freedom in the foreseeable future. 30 years. This is longer than the average lifespan of a slave. Far from their homeland, this detail is particularly cruel. A Roman slave could not hope for help from compatriots, could not hear his native language, could not observe Roman customs. He was doomed to complete assimilation or death. Here's what Seneca writes about the position of slaves in Rome. As many slaves as enemies, goes the proverb. No, they are not enemies, we make them enemies. At feasts the master may do anything. A slave may not even move his lips for the most necessary speech. The rod silences any whisper. And this is treatment of ordinary slaves. What can be said about prisoner slaves who just yesterday were enemies? Their fate was even more terrible. Suetonius tells of the cruelty of emperors toward captives. Here's what Caligula did. When the cattle with which wild beasts were fed for spectacles became expensive, he ordered criminals thrown to them. And walking through the prisons for this purpose, he didn't look at who was guilty of what, but standing at the doors, directly ordered taking everyone from bald head to bald head. And here's what Suetonius tells about Tiberius. On Capri, they still show the place of his slaughter. From here the condemned, after long and sophisticated tortures, were thrown into the sea before his eyes, and below sailors caught and smashed the corpses with boat hooks and oars so that no life remained in anyone. Stoic philosophy, what the wise said about slavery. But how did Roman philosophy regard captivity and slavery? Here Seneca comes to our aid, who reflected much on these questions. In his letters to Lucilius he wrote, "He is a slave, but perhaps free in soul. He is a slave. Will this harm him? Show me who is not a slave. One is enslaved to lust, another to greed, a third to ambition, and all to fear." Seneca tries to console. We are all slaves to our passions. But for a Roman legionnaire chained somewhere in a Germanic swamp, this philosophy was cold comfort. Seneca speaks more harshly about suicide as an escape from an unbearable situation. Roads to freedom are open everywhere, short and easy. No one can force life upon us, and we have the power to shame necessity. And indeed, many captives preferred death to disgrace. Seneca tells a chilling story. Recently, one German, who was being prepared for morning fights in the arena, withdrew as if for natural needs. No other chance to be alone was given him. There he took a stick with a sponge intended for wiping filth, and stuffing it whole down his throat, suffocated. Agree, a horrifying story. Imagine the despair of a man for whom death from a dirty sponge in a latrine seems a better option than life in slavery. Exceptions to the rules, when the system failed. Were there exceptions? Suetonius mentions the policy of exchanging hostages, but hostages are not captives or slaves. Hostages retained status and dignity, while captives did not. Sometimes noble captives were ransomed by relatives, but for a simple legionnaire, this was impossible. His family legally ceased to exist the moment of his capture. Particularly interesting is the case of Regulus. Regulus Marcus Atilius, a Roman naval commander, after several victories over the Carthaginians in the First Punic War, was taken captive. 5 years later, he was sent to Rome on his word of honor to ask for peace, but spoke in the Senate against making peace with Carthage. Not wanting to break his word, he returned to captivity and was subjected to torture. In particular, he was sent down a mountain in a box studded with nails. He died in Carthage. Here it is, Roman virtues in pure form. A man voluntarily returns to torture and death so as not to break his word given to an enemy. But note, even this heroic story ends with torment and death. For a Roman, there was no happy return from captivity. Suetonius tells of a case with Germanic ambassadors under Claudius. He allowed Germanic ambassadors to sit in the orchestra, as he was pleased by their simplicity and firmness. They were given places among the people, but they, noticing that Parthians and Armenians sat with senators, moved on their own to the same places, declaring that they were no lower than them in position or valor. This episode shows, even barbarian ambassadors had more rights and dignity than Roman citizens in captivity. Terrible details, what official chronicles kept silent. But let's delve into the darkest details of captives' fate, what official historians preferred to keep silent about, but what seeped into letters, philosophical treatises, casual mentions. Documentarily known are Tiberius's entertainments on Capri. He even invented a new method of torture, among others. Deliberately getting people drunk with pure wine, they would unexpectedly tie their genitals, and they suffered from the cutting, binding, and retention of urine. Here's what is known about executions under the same Tiberius. Ancient custom forbade strangling virgins, therefore he would have the executioner rape underage girls before execution. If they treated Roman citizens this way, what can be said about prisoners of war? An even more horrific story. Another time, a captive was being transported under guard in a cart, when suddenly he pretended to doze from fatigue and lowered his head so low that it fell between the spokes, but remained sitting in place while the wheel's turn broke his neck. Imagine the level of despair when a man uses a cartwheel as an instrument of suicide. The emperor's fate, Valerian, from purple to disgrace. But let's return to the most shocking story, to which I recently devoted an entire video, the capture of Emperor Valerian. Lactantius left us a detailed description of his humiliations. After he ended his life in such shameful slavery, they flayed his skin and cleaned the flesh, then painted it purple and placed it in the temple of barbarian gods as a monument to Roman disgrace. Roman ambassadors coming to the Persian court in subsequent decades first had to pass by this horrific emperor's effigy. Imagine their feelings. Yesterday's rulers of the world were forced to bow to the Persian king, passing by their emperor's skin. Women in captivity, a fate worse than death. A special chapter in the history of Roman captivity is the fate of women. Suetonius mentions that Augustus, for the first time, tried taking women as hostages from some, as he saw they did not value male hostages. Here's what I mentioned above about Germans. The Germans fear captivity much more for their women than for themselves. Why? Because the fate of female captives was terrible. Noble Roman women were turned into concubines of barbarian chiefs. Common ones were distributed among warriors as war booty. Many preferred suicide to such disgrace. History preserved the name of Shania, wife of a centurion from Varus's destroyed legion. When Germans burst into the camp, she first stabbed her 2 daughters with a dagger, then herself. The Germanic chief, amazed by her courage, ordered her buried with honors. This was an exception. Most female captives awaited a fate far more terrible. Children of war, the lost generation. The most tragic fate awaited children. Children of legionnaires born in military camps, children of colonists from frontier towns, all became prey to victors. Boys were either killed immediately, so they wouldn't grow up to be avengers, or raised as slaves. Some were castrated and sold to Eastern markets. Roman eunuch boys were highly valued in harems. Girls faced an even more terrible fate. Let's sum up. The paradox of the Roman military machine was that a society built on the cult of military glory did not forgive those who survived in captivity. Rome created the most effective military system of antiquity, but never solved what to do with those who fell into its millstones from the wrong side. Behind every lost legion's eagle stood the fates of specific people. Some relatives later erected tombstones, like Marcus Caelius, who died in the Teutoburg forest. But most were not even honored with a gravestone. 20,000 who disappeared in the Teutoburg forest, 10,000 lost in the sands after Carrhae, thousands of nameless captives sold into slavery after hundreds of minor defeats. The numbers of destroyed legions were never revived. As Suetonius writes, Augustus to the end of his life marked the day of defeat each year with mourning and grief. But the mourning was not for the dead fell with honor. The mourning was for the disappeared, for those whose fate was worse than death. The last document I want to quote is graffiti scratched on a wall in Pompeii. Lucius Annaeus of the 20th Legion was here. May the gods protect him from captivity. A simple soldier's prayer that says more than all official chronicles. Captivity remained a disgrace worse than death, and captives, ghosts whom they tried not to remember. Rome never learned to forgive those who had the misfortune to survive where they were supposed to die. In the end, perhaps the German who suffocated with a dirty sponge in a Roman latrine was wiser than all Roman philosophers. He understood a simple truth: sometimes death is not defeat, but the last victory of human dignity over an inhuman system. Sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes worldly glory, from legion eagles to slave collars, from imperial purple to skin stuffed with straw in a barbarian temple. The history of Roman prisoners of war is a story about how even the greatest empire cannot protect every one of its sons, and about how sometimes oblivion is more merciful than memory. Friends, if you enjoyed my story, support the channel, like and share your impressions in the comments. Thank you, and until we meet again.